The blizzard that swallowed Crow's Hollow did not arrive like ordinary weather. It arrived like a verdict. Wind tore across the Wyoming ridge with enough force to bend the pines and lift entire sheets of snow from the ground. Ice struck the face of 28-year-old Caleb Mercer as he stumbled through drifts, already climbing past his knees. One hand covered his eyes. The other held a rope tied to the collar of his dog, Flint. Caleb could no longer feel 3 of his toes. His fingers had stopped hurting nearly 20 minutes earlier. That frightened him more than the pain had. He knew what came next. First, winter took feeling, then strength, then judgment. And finally, if a man was unlucky enough to remain outside, it took the man himself. Caleb's legs finally gave way beside a cluster of wind-broken pines. He dropped to one knee, then both. For several seconds, he remained there while snow gathered across his shoulders. Maybe this was where it ended. Not in a gunfight, not beneath a falling tree, not in some great frontier tragedy people would remember. Just one exhausted carpenter disappearing quietly beneath the snow. Then Flint went mad. The dog jerked the rope from Caleb's weakened grip and bolted toward a limestone slope 30 yards away. "Flint!" The dog ignored him. He stopped beside what looked like an ordinary drift and began digging furiously. His paws tore through packed snow. He barked once, then again, sharp, urgent, relentless. Caleb forced himself upright. "Flint, get back here." The dog only dug harder. Then Caleb heard something, a sound that did not belong to the storm. He froze. Beneath the screaming wind came a low, hollow rush. Air, not blowing across the mountain, being pulled into it. Caleb crawled toward the dog and pressed one trembling hand against a narrow crack beneath the snow. A faint draft brushed his skin. Cold, but not nearly as cold as the air outside. That was when Caleb understood. The hill was breathing. Something was buried beneath them. And whatever it was, it might be the only reason he lived long enough to see morning. Before we continue, may I ask you a small favor? If you enjoy cinematic frontier survival stories like this, please consider subscribing. We're working hard to reach our very first 1,000 subscribers, and every single person who joins helps this channel keep bringing these forgotten stories back to life. Your support truly means more than you know. Now, let's return to the winter of 1878. Only a few hours earlier, Caleb Mercer had still been standing inside the farmhouse he had spent nearly half his life keeping alive. He had repaired its roof after hailstorms, replaced rotten floorboards, rebuilt the northern barn after a windstorm tore half of it away. Every autumn, he cut and stacked enough cedar to carry the household through winter. For 12 years, his hands had been in almost every piece of that property, but legally, none of it belonged to him. Caleb had buried his father 3 weeks earlier. Nathaniel Mercer had survived logging accidents, broken ribs, runaway horses, and more Wyoming winters than anyone cared to count. What finally killed him was a fever. He caught it while repairing the barn roof during a week of freezing autumn rain. Within 9 days, he was gone. And before the earth above his grave had completely frozen, Caleb's stepmother, Edith, took control of the property. The papers were clear. Nathaniel had never added his son's name to the deed. Caleb had always assumed there would be time. There wasn't. Edith began selling cattle. Then she started discussing timber rights with buyers from the south. Caleb said nothing. He kept working. Perhaps part of him still believed that 12 years of labor meant something. One evening, Edith proved otherwise. She placed the property papers on the kitchen table. "You have no claim here." Caleb stared at her. "I built half this place. You worked here." My father promised me the north acreage. Your father is dead." The words landed harder than Caleb expected. Outside, snow tapped softly against the window Caleb himself had repaired the winter before. Edith pushed a small canvas sack across the table. Inside were cornmeal, several strips of salt pork, and a handful of dried beans. Beside it lay an old wool blanket. "That's what I can give you." Caleb looked toward the window. Snow had started falling harder. Flint stood beside him, perfectly still. The old dog's fur lifted slightly along his neck. Caleb looked back at Edith. "You're sending me out tonight? I'm telling you this isn't your house." For several seconds, nobody moved. Caleb could hear the kitchen clock, the fire crackling behind him, the wind beginning to press against the walls. He wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her about every winter morning he had risen before his father to break ice from the livestock troughs, every roof beam he had lifted, every fence post he had driven into frozen earth, every year of his life buried inside that land. Instead, he picked up the sack, he took the blanket, and walked toward the door. An hour later, he heard the bolt slide into place behind him. Crow's Hollow was 14 miles south. In good weather, Caleb could have reached it before dark. This was not good weather. Within the first mile, snow began falling hard enough to erase the road behind him. By the second, water had seeped through one boot. By the third, the wind had become strong enough to force him sideways. Flint kept looking toward the western ridge. Caleb noticed. Dogs knew things. Every trapper understood that. They heard storms before men did, smelled predators before horses panicked, and sometimes they refused paths that looked perfectly safe. At first, Caleb ignored him. The road led south. South led to Crow's Hollow. Crow's Hollow meant shelter. But Flint kept pulling west. Wrong way. The dog pulled again. Caleb stopped. Through the snow, he studied the dark outline of the ridge. Then he noticed something. The wind behaved differently there. Across the open valley, it struck without interruption. But near the ridge, thick pine growth broke the current into smaller streams. The trees formed a natural windbreak. Flint barked. Caleb looked south, then west. Staying on the road was the sensible choice, but sensible choices could still kill a man. He stepped off the wagon trail. "All right." Flint immediately moved toward the trees. "Show me." The climb nearly killed him. Snow concealed loose stone beneath every step. His legs grew heavy, not tired, heavy. His thoughts began arriving more slowly. That was the warning Caleb feared most. Cold did not always kill through agony. Sometimes it made dying feel comfortable. Halfway up the ridge, Caleb saw a large pine bent sideways by decades of mountain wind. Beneath its branches lay a shallow pocket protected from the worst of the snow. He stopped. Just 5 minutes. That was what his mind told him. Sit down. Rest. Close your eyes. Flint suddenly lunged backward and bit Caleb's coat sleeve. The dog pulled hard. Caleb stared at him. Flint growled. Not at the storm. At Caleb. The message was clear. Do not sit down. Caleb forced himself upright. "All right, old boy." His voice was barely audible. "I'm moving." They continued climbing. Minutes later, Flint disappeared behind a limestone mound. Then the barking began. That was how Caleb found the crack, and the strange breath coming from beneath the earth. He dug beside Flint until his fingers struck something hard. Wood, blackened by age. He cleared more snow. Iron nails appeared. Then a straight edge. Nature rarely made straight lines. Someone had built something here. Caleb clawed away another layer of snow until an enormous timber door emerged from the hillside. Heavy iron straps crossed its surface. The hinges were almost completely buried. Caleb stared at it. It could have been anything. An abandoned root cellar, an old mining cache, a grave. For one brief moment, he wondered if opening it was a mistake. Then another gust struck the ridge. The decision was made for him. Whatever waited behind that door could not be more dangerous than staying outside. He grabbed the iron handle. Pulled. Nothing. He pulled again. The door shifted. A narrow gap opened. Air moved from inside. Dry air. Caleb pulled harder. The hinges groaned like something waking after a long sleep. He shoved Flint through first, then followed. The moment the door closed behind them, the storm disappeared. Not completely, but enough. The screaming wind became a distant vibration inside the earth. Caleb stood in absolute darkness. He struck a match. The small flame revealed the stone steps descending into the hillside. Cedar beams supported a narrow passage. Packed earth walls rose on both sides. Dry walls. Caleb moved the flame closer. No frost, no ice. Flint walked ahead. The dog did not growl. Caleb followed. The passage descended farther than he expected before opening into a chamber large enough to stop him where he stood. Shelves covered the walls, and every shelf held food. Glass jars of preserved beans and carrots, dried apples hanging from ceiling beams, barrels of grain raised on limestone blocks, potatoes buried in ash, salt pork suspended from iron hooks. Nothing had been abandoned carelessly. Everything had been measured, protected, prepared. At the center of the chamber stood a cast-iron stove. Behind it, a thick limestone wall rose from floor to ceiling. Beside the stove sat stacks of cedar firewood beneath oil-treated canvas. Dry firewood. Caleb almost laughed. Outside, families would soon be fighting to keep damp timber burning. Down here, someone had protected enough dry cedar to last for weeks, maybe months. Flint circled the stove once, then collapsed onto the earth floor. The dog had stopped trembling. Caleb wanted to celebrate. Instead, he forced himself to think. Shelter first. Fire second. Emotion later. He inspected the stove. Old ash remained inside. Dry. The pipe looked intact. He placed several pieces of cedar inside and struck another match. The fire caught immediately. For several seconds, everything worked. Then smoke rolled back into the chamber. Caleb jumped to his feet. Flint began barking. The draft had failed. Smoke thickened near the ceiling. Caleb grabbed a lantern and searched upward. Then he saw it. Water. Snowmelt was dripping through the ventilation shaft. The upper opening had been partially blocked. If he allowed the fire to continue, the shelter that had saved him from freezing could suffocate him instead. Caleb extinguished part of the flame and searched the wall. An iron rod hung beside the stove. He grabbed it, climbed onto a storage crate, then forced the rod upward into the shaft. Once, twice, nothing. He struck harder. Ice cracked somewhere above him. Then came a sudden rush of air. The lantern flame bent sideways. The stove changed sound. Smoke pulled upward. Within seconds, the chamber began clearing. Caleb stood perfectly still. He had learned his first lesson about the place. The shelter could save him, but only if he understood how to keep it alive. Hours later, steady warmth spread through the limestone behind the stove. Not powerful warmth, stable warmth. Caleb removed his wet boots. Pain returned to his feet in violent waves. He welcomed every second of it. Pain meant they were still alive. He ate beans, rye bread, and a small strip of salt pork. Then he lay beside Flint. For the first time since leaving the farm, Caleb allowed himself to believe he might survive. When he woke, the fire had nearly died, but the chamber was still warm. That confused him. Then he touched the limestone behind the stove. Heat remained trapped inside it. Slow heat, stored heat. Caleb finally understood. Above ground, a cabin fought winter from every direction. Wind struck every wall, cold entered every crack, heat escaped through every seam. But down here, the earth changed slowly. The hill itself protected the chamber from sudden temperature swings. Whoever built this place had not tried to overpower winter. He had reduced the number of ways winter could attack. Later that morning, Caleb explored deeper into the shelter. He found drainage channels cut along the floor, a second ventilation shaft hidden behind canvas, barrels raised above damp ground, food separated according to temperature and moisture. Nothing was accidental. Then, beneath several folded oilcloths, Caleb found a ledger. The cover carried a single name: Abel Whitmore. Caleb sat beside the stove and opened it. The pages contained years of observations: outside temperatures, snow depths, wood consumption, food storage, ventilation adjustments, condensation, failures, corrections. This was not the notebook of a man trying to prove how clever he was. It was the record of a man who had nearly frozen to death and refused to make the same mistake twice. One sentence had been pressed deeply into the paper. Caleb read it 3 times. Cabins lose heat because winter can touch every wall. The deeper Caleb read, the more he understood Abel Whitmore. Years earlier, Abel had worked at a freight station in the northern passes. During one catastrophic winter, the station began failing. Food spoiled from moisture. Firewood became damp. Wind penetrated every wall. 2 horses froze in harness. Men abandoned the station. Abel's younger brother disappeared during a supply run and never returned. One entry in the ledger contained only 6 words: built the walls higher, lost heat faster. Caleb stopped reading. There it was, the mistake that had changed Abel's life. He had responded to winter by building more walls, more fire, more protection, and somehow every addition had created another surface for the cold to attack. After that winter, Abel stopped building upward. He began digging down. The shelter was the result. Fewer exposed walls, less roof beneath the weight of snow, earth to slow temperature change, stone to store heat, ventilation to control moisture, drainage to protect supplies. The final entry on the page was shorter. The earth keeps what it covers better than men do. Caleb closed the ledger. For a long time he listened to the storm moving above him. Then he looked around the chamber. He finally understood what he had found. Not a bunker, not a cellar, a lesson. And the mountain had nearly killed one man so another could discover it. 2 days later, Caleb opened the shelter door. Only a few inches. The storm nearly tore it from his hands. Snow exploded into the passage. He forced the door wider and looked outside. The world was gone. No road, no fence lines, no horizon, only white. The pine trees stood like dark shadows before disappearing completely a few yards away. Caleb closed the door. For the first time, the truth struck him with its full weight. Had Flint followed the road, they would already be dead. There would have been no rescue, no cabin reached in time, no final miracle, just 2 shapes beneath a drift that spring might not uncover for months. Caleb looked down at Flint. The dog stared back. "You knew." Flint tilted his head. Caleb smiled. "Somehow, you knew." 4 days passed. Then Caleb noticed water forming along one ceiling beam. A single drop struck the floor, then another. Flint lifted his head. Caleb checked the grain. One sack felt damp. He immediately remembered Abel's warning. Warmth without airflow could destroy the shelter from inside. Too little heat could freeze them. Too much heat could create condensation, rot food, and poison the air. Caleb lowered the fire, moved the grain away from the warm limestone, cleared part of the drainage trench, then widened the intake vent. Within hours, the air changed. By morning, the ceiling was dry again. The shelter had breathed. Caleb was beginning to understand something Abel had learned through years of failure. Survival was not about creating the most heat. It was about controlling what you had. On the fifth night, someone knocked on the door. 3 weak impacts. Then silence. Flint stood instantly. Caleb grabbed the lantern. The knocking came again. Hold that sound in your mind for a second, because everything this shelter was about to become starts with that knock. If this story has you holding your breath right now, this is the perfect moment to subscribe, because stories like this one are exactly what this channel was built for. Now, Caleb climbed the passage and pulled the door open. A woman nearly fell inside. Her name was Ruth Bell, a widow from Crow's Hollow. One arm held her 9-year-old granddaughter, Elsie. The girl was barely conscious. "We saw smoke," Ruth whispered. Caleb pulled them inside. Elsie's gloves were frozen stiff. Her hands were pale. Caleb wrapped them in warm cloth and placed her near the stove. Flint lay against the girl's legs. Minutes passed. Then Elsie's fingers began to move. Ruth started crying, quietly, not because they were safe, because for the first time that night she believed they might be. After Ruth came others, a trapper with frostbite, a married couple whose chimney had collapsed, a ranch hand who had burned nearly all his firewood, then another family, and another. The shelter that had saved one man slowly became responsible for an entire community. But every new person created another problem. More bodies meant more moisture, more food consumed, more air needed, more wood burned. The shelter could protect them from winter. Crowding could still destroy it from within. Caleb established rules. Wet clothing stayed near the entrance. Food remained away from the warmest stone. The fire burned steadily, never excessively. Ventilation was checked every morning, drainage every evening. Sleeping spaces were arranged along the outer walls. Water was rationed. No one received more food because they arrived with money. No one received less because they arrived with nothing. Underground, winter did not care who had been rich above it. One night, an older rancher demanded more wood be added to the stove. "My wife is cold." Caleb shook his head. "Give her another blanket. We have enough cedar. The fire stays where it is." The rancher stepped closer. "You're saving wood while people freeze?" Caleb pointed toward the ceiling. "Look." A faint line of moisture had already begun forming near one beam. "If we overheat this chamber, that water reaches the grain." The man stared upward. "Then we lose food." Caleb nodded. "Then we burn more wood trying to dry the room." He looked around at the families sleeping nearby. "And eventually this shelter stops protecting us." The rancher slowly lowered his eyes. The fire remained unchanged. By morning, the condensation was gone. Caleb had learned the difference between giving people what they wanted and giving them what kept them alive. By the 8th night, Deputy Warren Cole arrived. His face was exhausted. His coat was torn. His wife was sick from sleeping beside freezing drafts. Warren stepped into the chamber expecting a crude hole in the ground. Instead, he found dry food, liquid water, sleeping families, a controlled fire, and walls holding warmth long after the flames weakened. He pressed one hand against the limestone, then looked at Caleb. "This hill holds heat better than my house." Caleb nodded. "It doesn't fight the cold." Warren looked around. "What does it do?" Caleb glanced toward Abel Whitmore's ledger. "It makes the cold work harder to get inside." For several seconds, Warren said nothing. Then he smiled faintly. "Your father would have liked this place." Caleb looked toward the fire. For the first time since being thrown from the farm, he thought about his father without thinking about what had been taken from him. Perhaps because he finally understood something. A man could lose a house without losing everything his hands had taught him. The storm weakened near the end of February. Not suddenly. One morning, the wind simply arrived with less anger. By evening, it had weakened further. Several days later, sunlight finally touched the valley. When the survivors emerged, Crow's Hollow looked wounded. Barns had collapsed, fences had disappeared, food stores were ruined, firewood piles had been reduced to scattered pieces of bark. Some cabins stood empty. Winter had eventually found every exposed wall, every roof, every crack. But beneath the limestone ridge, the shelter remained. Not untouched, maintained. That difference mattered. And when Crow's Hollow finally counted the cost of that winter, the numbers told the whole story. Above ground, 11 cabins stood damaged or abandoned, and the town had lost most of its stored grain. Beneath the ridge, 19 people had lived through the worst storm in a generation. 19 souls, one old dog, and not a single grave. And by the following autumn, more than 20 families across the valley had dug shelters and deep cellars into their own hillsides, copying page after page from a dead man's ledger. When spring arrived, people rebuilt differently. Root cellars became deeper. Food barrels were raised from damp floors. Ventilation shafts appeared in new storage buildings. Families thought about airflow, moisture, thermal mass, exposure. They still respected fire, but they no longer believed a larger fire was the answer to every cold night. Caleb never became famous. There were no statues, no newspaper stories, no speeches. Frontier towns rarely celebrated survival for long. There was always another fence to repair, another field to plant, another winter waiting somewhere beyond autumn. But people listened when Caleb spoke. They watched how he stored food, how he stacked wood, how he controlled airflow, how he used stone and earth instead of relying only on flame. Years later, travelers passing through Crow's Hollow would notice that many homes had deep shelters built into the hills. Most never knew why. They never knew about Abel Whitmore. They never knew about the ledger. They never knew about the carpenter who had been locked outside his own home in the middle of a blizzard. And they certainly never knew that the entire story had begun with an old dog refusing to follow the road. One spring evening, Caleb stood outside the entrance to the shelter. Snowmelt dripped from the pine branches. Flint rested beside him. The dog's muzzle had grown gray. Thin smoke rose from the hidden ventilation shaft above the hill. Caleb looked toward the road leading back to his father's farm. For months, he had believed that losing that house had been the worst thing that ever happened to him. Now, he wasn't so sure. If Edith had never locked the door, he would never have entered the storm. If the storm had never forced him from the road, he would never have followed Flint. And if Flint had never heard the mountain breathing, the shelter might have remained buried until everyone who needed it was gone. Caleb lowered one hand and rested it on the dog's head. Flint looked toward the ridge, still watching, still listening. Caleb smiled. That winter, every sensible man would have followed the road to town. Caleb Mercer survived because he didn't. He followed a dog into the storm, and beneath a mountain that should have become his grave, he found the place that would keep an entire valley alive. Because sometimes the door that closes behind you is not the end of your story. Sometimes it is the storm's way of pushing you toward the door you were always meant to find. Losing everything is not the same as being lost, and the ones who survive are rarely the ones who fight the hardest. They are the ones humble enough to listen, even when the voice guiding them cannot speak a single word. Here's what I want to know from you. If you had been standing on that road, freezing, with town 14 miles ahead, and your dog pulling the other way, would you have trusted him? Tell me honestly in the comments, because I read every single one. And if this story earned your time tonight, leave a like and subscribe so the next Forgotten Frontier story finds you. Thank you for spending this time with us. See you in the next story.